The stagecoach rattled over another rut in the dusty Montana road, and Eleanor Hartley gripped the worn leather bag in her lap a little tighter. Inside were all her worldly possessions: 2 dresses, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and the letters. 23 letters from Gerald Winchester, a banker in Silver Creek who needed a wife and had promised her security, respectability, and a fresh start far from the whispers of Boston society. At 26, Eleanor knew she was past the age when most women married. Her family had made that abundantly clear when they'd packed her bags with barely concealed relief. "You're fortunate Mr. Winchester is willing to overlook your situation," her aunt had said, meaning her age, her lack of dowry, and the scandal of her broken engagement 3 years prior. Eleanor touched the small scar above her left eyebrow, hidden by her dark hair, a reminder of the night Thomas had shown his true nature, and she'd refused to marry him despite the arrangements already made. Her family had never forgiven her for the embarrassment. The stagecoach driver called out, and Eleanor peered through the dusty window. Silver Creek wasn't much to look at, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings scattered along the road. Mountains rose in the distance, still crowned with snow, despite it being late spring. "Last stop, miss," the driver announced, opening the door. Eleanor stepped down, her legs unsteady after 3 days of travel. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, quieter. A few people moved along the wooden boardwalks, but no one paid her much attention. No one except the man leaning against the post outside the general store. He was tall, impossibly tall, Eleanor thought, with broad shoulders that strained against a worn work shirt. Dark hair fell to his collar beneath a dusty hat, and even from a distance she could see the intensity of his gaze as he watched her. He didn't look away when their eyes met, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Miss Hartley?" A different voice made her turn. A shorter man in a fine suit approached, his smile practiced and pleasant. "I'm Gerald Winchester. Welcome to Silver Creek." He was exactly as she'd imagined from his letters. Neat, proper, with soft hands that had never done hard labor. He took her bag with careful courtesy and gestured toward a buggy. "I've arranged rooms for you at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house until the wedding. I thought you might want a few days to settle in, get to know the town." "That's very thoughtful," Eleanor murmured, though her eyes drifted back to the tall man by the store. He'd straightened now, and she could see he was even larger than she'd first thought. 6.5 feet at least, with the kind of solid build that came from years of ranch work. Gerald followed her gaze, and his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's Caleb Morgan. He owns the Triple M Ranch about 10 miles outside town. You'll want to avoid men like that, Eleanor. He's rough, not the kind of company a banker's wife should keep." Eleanor wanted to ask what he meant, but Gerald was already helping her into the buggy, chattering about the town's prospects and his position at the bank. She nodded in the right places, but her mind kept drifting to the quiet cowboy and the way his dark eyes had seemed to see right through her. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was clean and simple, with lace curtains and the smell of fresh bread in the air. The elderly landlady showed Eleanor to a small room on the 2nd floor, fussing over her like a mother hen. "Mr. Winchester is a fine man," Mrs. Patterson said, smoothing the quilt on the bed. "Very respectable. You're lucky to have caught his attention, dear." Lucky. Eleanor had heard that word so many times in the past month, it had lost all meaning. She smiled politely and thanked Mrs. Patterson, waiting until the woman left before sinking onto the bed. Through the window, she could see the main street. The tall cowboy, Caleb Morgan, was mounting a massive black horse. He moved with easy confidence, settling into the saddle like he belonged there. For just a moment, he glanced up at her window, and Eleanor stepped back quickly, her heart beating faster than it should. That evening, Gerald took her to dinner at the town's small restaurant. He was attentive and polite, pulling out her chair and ordering for both of them, without asking what she wanted. He talked about his plans for their future: a proper house on the edge of town, children eventually, her role in the community as his wife. "I know the circumstances of our arrangement aren't romantic," Gerald said, reaching across the table to pat her hand. "But I believe we can build a good partnership, Eleanor. I need a wife who understands propriety and social standing. You need security and a fresh start. It's practical. Practical. Not loving, not passionate, but safe." Eleanor told herself That was enough. It had to be. Over the next 3 days, she explored Silver Creek and met the townspeople. Everyone spoke highly of Gerald Winchester, his success, his ambition, his bright future. No one mentioned warmth or kindness, but they praised his business acumen endlessly. She saw Caleb Morgan twice more. Once at the general store, where he was buying supplies, his cart loaded with flour and coffee and other ranch necessities. He tipped his hat to her, a simple gesture, but his eyes had held hers for a long moment before he turned away. The second time was at the church. Eleanor had gone to sit quietly in the empty building, seeking some peace before the wedding that was now only 4 days away. She'd been there maybe 10 minutes when the door opened and Caleb walked in. He stopped when he saw her, his hat in his hands. "Didn't mean to intrude, Ma'am." "You're not," Eleanor said quickly. "I was just thinking." He nodded slowly and moved to sit in a pew several rows behind her. Eleanor tried to return to her prayers, but she was intensely aware of his presence. After a few minutes of silence, she heard his deep voice. "You don't look happy for a woman about to be married." Eleanor turned in her seat. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his strong jaw. He had to be in his mid-30s, she guessed, with the kind of face that had seen hardship, but hadn't been hardened by it. It's complicated," she said finally. "Most things worth doing are." He turned his hat in his hands, studying it like it held answers. "Gerald Winchester is a respectable man, successful. You'll want for nothing materially." "But," Eleanor heard the unspoken word in his tone. Caleb's dark eyes met hers. "But he's cold, cares more about appearance than substance, the kind of man who'll treat you like a fine piece of furniture. Something to display, but not to actually know." The accuracy of the observation took Eleanor's breath away. "You don't even know me. Why would you care?" "Because I watched you step off that stagecoach 3 days ago, and I saw the look in your eyes. You're running from something, same as half the people who come west. But you're running toward the wrong thing if you think Winchester will make you happy." "Happiness isn't everything," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Security matters. Respectability matters." "Does it? More than being truly known, more than being cherished instead of just kept." Caleb stood, his frame seeming to fill the small church. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. I'm speaking out of turn. It's just, I've been alone for 5 years since my wife died. I know what it's like to live in a house that's not a home. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." He moved toward the door, but Eleanor stood quickly. "Wait." He stopped, turning back to her. "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor said softly. Something flickered across Caleb's face, pain mixed with something tender. "Sarah, she was small like you, with a laugh that could light up a room. We had 2 years together before the fever took her. Not nearly enough time." He paused. "But I'd rather have had those 2 years of real love than a lifetime of polite partnership." After he left, Eleanor sat in the quiet church for a long time, her hands trembling in her lap. The next morning, she woke to find a note had been slipped under her door. The handwriting was rough but legible. "If you want to see what real Montana looks like before you tie yourself to a town banker, ride out to the Triple M Ranch. No obligations. Just a chance to choose what you really want. CM." Eleanor held the note for a long time. The sensible thing would be to throw it away, to forget about the tall cowboy with the sad eyes and the offer that could ruin everything. Gerald Winchester was safe, respectable, exactly what her family expected. But when had doing what others expected ever made her happy? She borrowed a gentle mare from the livery stable, telling the owner she wanted to explore the countryside. The directions to the Triple M were easy enough to follow. 10 miles north, past the creek, through the valley where wildflowers bloomed in purple and gold. The ranch appeared gradually, nestled against the foothills. It was bigger than she'd expected, with a sturdy house, several barns and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. Caleb was working with a horse in the corral, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. He looked up when she approached, surprise and something else. Hope, maybe, crossing his features. "You came." "I shouldn't have," Eleanor said, dismounting. "Gerald would be furious if he knew." "Then why did you?" Eleanor searched for the right words. "Because you were right. I am running from something, and I'm tired of making choices based on fear and other people's expectations." Caleb secured the horse he'd been working with and walked over to her. Up close, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was so much bigger than her, so much stronger, but there was gentleness in the way he took her horse's reins. "Let me show you around," he said. Over the next few hours, Caleb walked Eleanor through his ranch. He introduced her to his ranch hands, 3 men who clearly respected him. He showed her the garden Sarah had planted, now overgrown, but still producing wild roses. He took her up to a ridge, where they could see for miles, the mountains purple in the distance. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "Lonely sometimes?" Caleb admitted. "This house was built for a family. Been feeling pretty empty these last 5 years." They sat on a fallen log, watching the sun move across the sky. Eleanor found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone. About Thomas and his cruelty, about her family's disappointment, about feeling like a burden no one wanted. "You're not a burden," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're brave. You survived something hard and you kept going. That takes strength. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm about to marry a man I don't love because I'm too afraid to do anything else." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "Can I tell you something? When I first saw you step off that stagecoach, my heart started beating again for the first time in 5 years. I told myself I was being a fool, that you were promised to Winchester, that I had no right even talking to you. But I kept thinking, what if she doesn't know she has a choice? What if she thinks this is all she deserves?" Eleanor's breath caught. "Caleb, I'm not a rich man like Winchester," he continued, turning to face her. "I can't offer you fancy dresses or a big house in town, but I can promise you'll never doubt you're wanted. That you'll be cherished, not just kept. That every day I'll thank God you chose to be here." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "I barely know you. I know, and I'm not asking you to marry me today or even promise me anything. I'm just asking, don't marry Winchester because you think you have to. Don't settle for being tolerated when you could be adored." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His hand was rough with calluses, but his touch was achingly tender. "I want you to choose me because you really want to, not because you have nowhere else to go." Eleanor leaned into his touch without thinking, her eyes closing. When had anyone ever touched her with such careful reverence? "He'll be furious," she whispered. "Gerald, the whole town will talk." "Let them talk." Caleb's thumb traced her jawline. "You've spent your whole life worried about what other people think. What do you want, Eleanor?" She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd been honest with her from the start, who'd offered her a choice instead of an obligation, who looked at her like she was something precious. "I want," she started, then stopped. Did she dare say it? Did she dare reach for something real instead of settling for something safe? Caleb waited, patient, his dark eyes holding hers. "I want to feel alive," Eleanor said finally. "I want to matter to someone. She drew a shaky breath. "I want to know what it's like to be loved." "Then stay," Caleb said simply. "Stay here with me. I can't promise everything will be easy, but I can promise you'll never doubt you matter." They sat there on the ridge as the sun began to set, not touching beyond his hand, still cradling her face. Eleanor felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into unknown waters. "I need to tell Gerald myself," she said finally. "It wouldn't be right to just disappear." Caleb nodded, though she saw the flash of fear in his eyes, the fear that she wouldn't come back, that she'd let Winchester talk her out of this. "I'll take you back to town whenever you're ready." They rode back as twilight fell, Caleb on his black horse, and Eleanor on the borrowed mare. At the edge of town, he stopped. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "whatever you decide, I meant what I said. You deserve to be cherished." She looked up at him, this giant of a man with the gentle heart, and made her choice. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, "after I talk to Gerald." Something like sunrise crossed Caleb's face. Hope, joy, relief, all mixed together. He didn't touch her, didn't press for promises, just tipped his hat and watched as she rode into town. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She rehearsed what she'd say to Gerald 100 times, imagining his anger, the town's gossip, her family's inevitable disgust when they heard. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted but certain. She found Gerald at the bank, in his neat office with its polished desk and leather chairs. "Eleanor!" He stood smiling. "I was just going over the final arrangements for Saturday. The Reverend will—" "I can't marry you," Eleanor said, the words coming out in a rush. Gerald's smile froze. I beg your pardon. I can't marry you, Gerald. I'm sorry. You've been nothing but kind and proper, but I don't love you. And I don't think you love me either. We'd be miserable. His face darkened. This is about Morgan, isn't it? I saw you ride out yesterday. People talk, Eleanor. This is about me, Eleanor said firmly, about choosing something real instead of something safe. Real? Gerald laughed bitterly. He's a cowboy, Eleanor, a man who smells like horses and lives miles from civilization. You think that's better than what I'm offering? You think ranch life is romantic? It's hard work, isolation, and poverty. Maybe, Eleanor said, but it's also honest. You want a wife who'll look good at dinner parties and manage your household? That's not love, Gerald. That's a business arrangement. And that's exactly what our letters outlined. Gerald's composure cracked. I was honest about what I needed. You agreed to those terms. I know, and I'm sorry for changing my mind, but I can't live a lie just because it's convenient. Eleanor set the packet of his letters on his desk. I hope you find someone who wants what you're offering. I'm just not her. She left before he could argue further, her hands shaking but her steps steady. Behind her, she heard him call out something about her reputation, about her making a terrible mistake, but she didn't stop. Mrs. Patterson was less kind when Eleanor paid for her room and collected her bag, throwing over a respectable man like Mr. Winchester for a rough cowboy. The elderly woman sniffed. Your family will be mortified. Probably, Eleanor agreed, but they'll manage. She rode out to the Triple M ranch with the morning sun warm on her back. Caleb was in the corral again, working with a young colt. He looked up when he heard hoofbeats, and Eleanor saw the question in his eyes. She didn't make him wait. I told him, she called out as she approached, I'm not marrying Gerald Winchester. Caleb's face transformed. He vaulted over the corral fence with surprising grace for such a large man and strode toward her. Eleanor dismounted, and suddenly he was there, towering over her, his hands hovering near her shoulders like he wanted to touch her but wasn't sure he was allowed. You're sure? His voice was rough with emotion. You're really sure? I'm terrified, Eleanor admitted. But yes, I'm sure. I want to choose this. I want to choose you. Caleb let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob and pulled her into his arms. Eleanor pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her cheek. He was so warm, so solid, and she felt safer than she had in years. You won't regret this, Caleb murmured into her hair. I swear, Eleanor, you won't regret this. I know, she whispered, and realized she meant it. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. I need to do this right. Court you proper. Give you time to be sure. I am sure, Eleanor said. Even so, his thumb traced her cheekbone. You deserve to be courted, Eleanor Hartley. Flowers and sweet words and all the things you should have had before. I just want you, Eleanor said, and watched his eyes darken with something that made her stomach flutter. You have me, Caleb said. You've had me since the moment I saw you. But I want everyone to know you chose this freely, that you're not just running from Winchester, but running towards something you really want. Over the next month, Caleb courted Eleanor with patient devotion. He rode into town twice a week to take her on proper outings, picnics by the creek, walks through the wildflower meadows, quiet dinners where they talked for hours. He brought her books he thought she'd like. Wildflowers picked from the ranch, small tokens that showed he was thinking of her. The town gossip was fierce at first. Gerald made sure everyone knew Eleanor had jilted him for that rough cowboy. Some of the townspeople looked at her with disapproval, but others, especially the women who'd seen the coldness in Gerald Winchester's eyes, quietly wished her well. Mrs. Patterson remained cool toward Eleanor, but she didn't ask her to leave the boarding house. I run a respectable establishment, she'd said stiffly, but I suppose even fallen women need a roof over their heads until they come to their senses. Eleanor had bitten back a sharp reply. She was learning that living authentically meant enduring other people's judgment, and she found she could bear it far better than she'd borne the suffocation of living for others' approval. The third week after she'd broken her engagement, Eleanor was helping at the general store. Mrs. Chen, the owner's wife, had kindly offered her some work to help pay for her room when 3 women came in. They grew quiet when they saw her, whispering behind their hands. One of them, a sharp-faced woman named Margaret Leeds, spoke loud enough for Eleanor to hear. Imagine throwing over a successful banker for a dirt-poor cowboy. Some women have no sense at all. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bolt of fabric she'd been measuring. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the store. Caleb Morgan owns one of the most successful ranches in 3 counties. It was Sarah Chen, emerging from the back room with her arms crossed. He's got more integrity in his little finger than Gerald Winchester has in his whole body. And if you don't like who shops in my store, Margaret Leeds, you're welcome to take your business elsewhere. Margaret huffed and left with her companions. Sarah turned to Eleanor with a kind smile. Don't let them get to you, dear. Half of them are jealous because their own marriages are cold as January frost. The other half wish they'd had your courage when they were young. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. No thanks needed. I've seen the way Caleb looks at you. That man would move mountains for you. That's worth more than all of Gerald Winchester's money. Caleb never pressured her, never pushed for more than she was ready to give. But Eleanor felt the heat building between them with every lingering touch, every long look. When he helped her down from the wagon, his hands would linger on her waist. When they walked, he'd take her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. One afternoon, he took her riding through the high meadows. They stopped by a crystal-clear stream, and Caleb spread a blanket under a massive pine tree. Eleanor sat beside him, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body, so close to hers. "Tell me about Boston," Caleb said, lying back on the blanket with his hands behind his head. "What was your life like before?" Eleanor hesitated, then lay down beside him, looking up through the pine branches at the impossibly blue sky. "Suffocating," she said finally. "Everything was about appearances, the right dress, the right friends, the right opinions. I felt like I was slowly disappearing, becoming whoever my family needed me to be. And Thomas." Caleb's voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor heard the tension beneath it. "Thomas was my family's choice. Wealthy, well-connected. For 6 months, I tried to convince myself I could love him." She touched the scar above her eyebrow unconsciously. "Then one night, we were alone in my family's garden. He'd had too much to drink at dinner. When I refused his advances, he got angry, said I was his, that I had no right to deny him since we were practically married anyway." Caleb had gone very still beside her. "He grabbed me, pushed me against a stone wall. I hit my head." Eleanor's voice was steady now, the old fear finally losing its power. "But I fought back, screamed. A servant heard and came running, and Thomas left. I told my family the next morning that I wouldn't marry him. They said I was overreacting, that all men got a bit rough sometimes, that I should be grateful he still wanted me after I'd made such a scene." "Eleanor," Caleb's voice was rough with barely contained rage. "It's all right," she said, turning her head to look at him. "I'm all right. I refused to marry him, and my family never forgave me. But I'd rather be disgraced than dead inside." Caleb rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. His dark eyes blazed with fierce protectiveness. "If I ever see Thomas, I won't be responsible for my actions." "You won't have to. He's 3,000 miles away and part of a life I'm never going back to." Eleanor reached up to touch Caleb's face, feeling the muscle jump in his jaw. "You would never hurt me. I knew that from the first moment I saw you." "How?" Caleb caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "How could you know that?" "Because of the way you looked at me. Like I was something precious, like I mattered," she smiled. "And because you gave me a choice. Thomas tried to take my choices away. Gerald wanted to dictate my choices, but you offered me freedom." Caleb leaned down slowly, his eyes searching hers. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. This kiss was different from the gentle one in the church. This was heat and hunger barely restrained. Caleb's large hand cradling her head with aching tenderness, even as his mouth claimed hers with growing passion. Eleanor melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We should stop," he said raggedly, "before I forget myself entirely." "What if I don't want you to stop?" Eleanor said boldly, surprising herself. Caleb groaned. "You're killing me, woman. But I meant what I said. I want to do this right. Court you proper, make you my wife before—" He pulled back, putting some distance between them, his breath still coming fast. "You deserve that respect." Eleanor sat up, her heart pounding. She'd never felt this alive, this desired, this cherished, all at once. How much longer? Soon, Caleb promised, his voice like gravel. Very soon, because I don't know how much longer I can keep my hands off you. The tension between them became almost unbearable over the next 2 weeks. Every touch, every glance, every moment alone felt charged with possibility. Caleb's restraint was visibly fraying, and Eleanor found herself pushing against it, testing his control in small ways that made his eyes darken with want. One evening, she was staying late at the ranch, helping Caleb prepare for a cattle auction. They were in the barn, Eleanor recording numbers while Caleb inspected each animal. The sun had set, and lantern light cast dancing shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Eleanor had climbed the ladder to the loft to retrieve a record book when her foot slipped. She gasped, losing her balance, and then strong hands caught her, Caleb having moved with surprising speed despite his size. He set her down carefully, but didn't let go. They stood in the shadowed barn, his hands on her waist, her palms pressed against his chest, both of them breathing harder than the moment warranted. "You scared me," Caleb said roughly. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, but she didn't step back. Neither did he. "Eleanor," her name was almost a groan. I should take you back to town." "Not yet," she said. "Please, just hold me for a moment." Caleb pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her completely. Eleanor pressed her face against his chest, hearing the rapid thunder of his heart. His scent surrounded her, leather and hay and something uniquely him that made her head spin. "I can't wait much longer," Caleb confessed into her hair. "I think about you constantly, wonder what it would be like to have you in my home, in my bed, in my life permanently. I'm going half crazy wanting you." Eleanor pulled back just enough to look up at him. In the lamplight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, his dark eyes blazing. "Then don't wait. Marry me, Caleb. Tomorrow, next week, I don't care. I just want to be yours." His control finally snapped. He kissed her with desperate hunger, backing her against the barn wall with his large body caging her in, protective and possessive all at once. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him down to her. "Saturday," Caleb said when they broke apart, both of them shaking. "I can't wait any longer than Saturday. Will you marry me on Saturday, Eleanor Hartley?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Yes, yes, yes." He kissed her again, softer this time, but no less intense, then forced himself to step back. "I need to get you back to town before I forget every gentleman's rule I've ever learned." They rode back in charged silence, Caleb keeping her tucked against him on his horse, rather than letting her ride separately. Every few minutes he'd press a kiss to her temple or tighten his arm around her waist, as if reassuring himself she was real. One evening, 6 weeks after she'd arrived in Silver Creek, they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset. Caleb had his arm around her shoulders, and Eleanor was tucked against his side, marveling at how perfectly she seemed to fit there, despite their difference in size. "I talked to Reverend Miller yesterday," Caleb said quietly. "Told him I'd be needing his services soon, if you're willing." Eleanor's heart raced. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you're ready, if you're sure this is what you want." He turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "Because once you're mine, Eleanor, I'm never letting you go. I'll spend every day of my life making sure you know you're loved." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "I've never been more sure of anything." Caleb's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her with aching tenderness. Eleanor melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as his arms came around her, holding her close but carefully, like she was something precious. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Saturday," he said. "Marry me on Saturday, Eleanor. I can't wait any longer than that." "Saturday," she agreed, and felt joy bubble up in her chest like champagne. They were married 4 days later in the small church, with half the town attending out of curiosity and the other half staying away in solidarity with Gerald Winchester. Eleanor wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Caleb had picked that morning. When Reverend Miller asked if she took this man to be her husband, Eleanor looked up at Caleb, at his strong, kind face and the love shining in his eyes, and said, "I do," with absolute certainty. Caleb's vows were simple but heartfelt. "I promise to cherish you, protect you, and make sure you never doubt you're wanted. I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb cupped Eleanor's face in his large, gentle hands and kissed her like she was his salvation. And maybe, Eleanor thought as she kissed him back, they were each other's salvation. Two lonely souls who'd found their way home. The reception at the ranch was small but joyful. Caleb's ranch hands had decorated the barn with lanterns and wildflowers. There was fiddle music and dancing, and Eleanor laughed more than she had in years as Caleb spun her around the floor, his size making him surprisingly graceful. Old Charlie, Caleb's foreman who'd worked the ranch for 20 years, raised a toast. "I've known Caleb Morgan since he was barely old enough to sit a horse," he said, his weathered face creasing with emotion. "Never thought I'd see him smile again after we lost Sarah. But Miss Eleanor, Mrs. Morgan now, you've brought light back to this ranch. To him, we're all grateful you had the courage to choose him." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as the small gathering applauded. Caleb squeezed her hand under the table, his thumb stroking her knuckles. As twilight fell and the guests began to leave, Caleb pulled Eleanor aside. The last rays of sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. "Are you happy?" he asked, studying her face like he was memorizing every detail. "Deliriously," Eleanor said honestly, "though I'm a little nervous about—" She blushed, not quite able to finish the sentence. Caleb's eyes softened with understanding. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said gently. "I meant what I said. I'll never hurt you, Eleanor. We can take things as slow as you need." But Eleanor surprised herself by shaking her head. "I'm not afraid. Not with you, it's just I don't know what to expect, what to do." Caleb's expression became impossibly tender. "You don't have to do anything except tell me if you want me to stop. I'll take care of everything else." He took her hand and led her toward the house, past the knowing grins of his ranch hands. Inside, he'd prepared the bedroom with care. Fresh flowers on the dresser, clean sheets on the bed that smelled of lavender, candles casting soft, warm light that made the room feel like a sanctuary. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, her heart racing. The reality of what was about to happen made her breath catch, not with fear, but with anticipation. Caleb came up behind her slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and steady through the thin fabric of her wedding dress. "I've imagined this moment for weeks," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Wanted you for what feels like forever, but we go at your pace, Eleanor. Always." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who was now her husband. "I want this. I want you. I'm just inexperienced." "Good," Caleb said fiercely. "That means I get to show you how it should be, how you should be touched, treasured." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "Thomas tried to take from you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life giving to you." He kissed her then, deeply, thoroughly, his hands beginning to explore with careful reverence. Eleanor had been kissed before, chaste pecks from her broken engagement, stolen kisses in gardens that had left her cold, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the way Caleb made her feel both cherished and desired, protected and free. His fingers found the buttons at the back of her dress, and he paused. "Can I?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his dark eyes drinking in every inch of skin revealed. Eleanor fought the urge to cover herself, reminded herself that this was her husband, that he wanted her. "You're so beautiful," Caleb said, his voice rough with barely restrained desire. "So damn beautiful, Eleanor." "You're still dressed," she pointed out, surprised at her own boldness. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. "You want to undress me, wife?" The word sent a thrill through her. Wife. She was his wife. Eleanor reached up to the buttons of his shirt with trembling fingers. Caleb stood perfectly still, letting her explore at her own pace. When she pushed the shirt from his shoulders, she couldn't help but stare. She'd known he was strong, had seen him lift hay bales that would take two normal men, but seeing him bare-chested took her breath away. Hard muscle covered by sun-bronzed skin, a scattering of dark hair across his broad chest. Scars, too, marks of a life lived hard and honest. "You're so much bigger than me," Eleanor said, placing her small hand against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering beneath her palm, beating as fast as her own. "I'll be careful," Caleb promised, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "You're so small, so delicate. I'll die before I hurt you." He picked her up effortlessly, cradling her against his chest as he carried her to the bed. Eleanor felt surrounded by him, overwhelmed by his size and strength, but never frightened. He laid her down gently, following her onto the mattress with controlled grace. "Tell me if anything doesn't feel right," he said, positioning himself over her carefully, supporting his weight so he wouldn't crush her. "Promise me, Eleanor." "I promise," she whispered, her hands coming up to touch his face. "But Caleb, I don't want you holding back. I want all of you." Something dark and heated flashed in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're asking for." "Then show me," Eleanor said, and watched his restraint crack. What followed was tender and passionate, with Caleb's patience and care making Eleanor feel worshipped rather than used. He took his time exploring her, learning what made her gasp and what made her sigh. His hands, so large and strong, touched her with exquisite gentleness. When he finally joined their bodies, Eleanor did gasp at the unfamiliar sensation, the feeling of being filled, completed. Caleb stilled immediately, his whole body tense with the effort of holding back. "Breathe," he coached, pressing kisses to her face. "Just breathe, sweetheart. The discomfort will pass, I promise." Eleanor focused on his voice, on the tenderness in his touch, and gradually her body adjusted. When she tentatively moved her hips, experimenting, Caleb groaned like he was in pain. "Don't," he gritted out. "Not yet. Give yourself time." But Eleanor was discovering something wonderful. Power. Despite their difference in size, despite his strength, she affected him. She could see it in the tension of his body, the way his jaw clenched, the darkness of his eyes. "I'm all right," she assured him. "Better than all right. You can move." Caleb began to move with exquisite care, watching her face for any sign of pain. The initial discomfort faded, replaced by growing pleasure that built with each deliberate thrust. Eleanor found herself clinging to his shoulders, amazed by the intimacy of this act, the way it bound them together in a way nothing else could. "Eleanor," Caleb groaned her name like a prayer. "God, Eleanor, you're perfect." The pleasure crested unexpectedly, washing over Eleanor in waves that made her cry out. Caleb followed moments later, her name on his lips as he buried his face in her neck. Afterward, he held her close, her small frame tucked perfectly against his large one. Eleanor traced patterns on his chest, marveling at the solid strength of him, at the way their bodies fit together despite, or perhaps because of, their differences. "No regrets?" Caleb asked softly, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Not a single one," Eleanor said. This is exactly where I'm meant to be." "I love you," Caleb said, the words rough but heartfelt. "I should have said it before, but I was afraid you'd change your mind. Afraid I didn't deserve this second chance." Eleanor pushed herself up on her elbow to look at him. "You deserve every happiness, Caleb Morgan. And I love you too. I think I started falling for you the moment you told me I had a choice." He pulled her down for a long, sweet kiss. "Get some rest, wife. Because when you wake up, I'm going to spend the entire day showing you just how much I love you." Eleanor fell asleep in her husband's arms, feeling safer and more loved than she'd ever felt in her life. The first weeks of their marriage were a revelation. Eleanor had expected adjustments, difficulties, the normal challenges of two people learning to live together. And there were adjustments. Learning Caleb's routines, figuring out how to manage the household, getting used to the isolation of ranch life. But mostly there was joy. Caleb woke her each morning with kisses, making love to her with a tenderness that never failed to move her to tears. He taught her to ride better, his patience endless, as she learned to handle the spirited mare he'd given her as a wedding gift. He showed her every corner of the ranch, introducing her to each cow like they were old friends, pointing out the places where Sarah had left her mark. "Does it bother you?" Eleanor asked one day as they stood in the overgrown garden Sarah had planted. "That I'm here? That I've taken her place?" Caleb pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "You haven't taken her place, Eleanor. You've made your own place, carved out your own space in my heart. Sarah was my first love, and I'll always treasure what we had. But you're my second chance, my proof that life goes on, that happiness can be found even after loss." He turned her to face him. "I love you completely, wholly, without reservation. Never doubt that." Eleanor learned to manage the household with help from Maria, an older Mexican woman who came twice a week to help with the heavier cleaning. Maria had known Sarah and had been skeptical of Eleanor at first, but she warmed quickly when she saw how Caleb smiled now, how the house felt alive again. "He is a good man," Maria told Eleanor one day, as they worked together in the kitchen. He deserves to be happy. You make him happy. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. Ranch life was harder than Eleanor had imagined. Early mornings, when Caleb had to check distant pastures before dawn, leaving her alone in the big house. Physical labor that left her hands rough and her back aching. Long periods of isolation when weather made the trip to town impossible. There was the day she tried to surprise Caleb with his favorite meal and burned everything, filling the house with smoke. He'd come running from the barn, thinking something terrible had happened, only to find her in tears amid the ruins of dinner. Instead of being angry, he'd laughed and pulled her into his arms. "Charlie's been telling me I should hire a cook anyway," he'd teased. Guess he was right. "I wanted to do something nice for you," Eleanor had sobbed against his chest. "You do nice things for me every day," Caleb had said seriously. "You smile when I wake up. You kiss me goodbye when I leave for the day. You're here when I come home. That's all I need, Eleanor, not perfect meals. Just you." There was the terrible week when Caleb had to help a neighboring rancher round up scattered cattle, staying away for 6 days. Eleanor had never felt so lonely, jumping at every sound in the empty house, barely sleeping without his solid warmth beside her. When he'd finally come home, dusty and exhausted, she'd thrown herself into his arms with such force he'd staggered back. "I missed you," she'd said, clinging to him. "God, Caleb, I missed you so much." "Never again," he'd promised, carrying her straight to their bedroom despite his exhaustion. "I'm not leaving you for that long ever again. I was half crazy without you, but there were also unexpected joys." She learned to bake bread in the kitchen Sarah had designed, and Caleb's face when he tasted her first successful loaf made all the failures worthwhile. She learned to ride better, sometimes accompanying Caleb to check on the cattle, loving the feeling of freedom as they galloped across open meadows. She planted a garden and watched it thrive under the Montana sun, feeling a deep satisfaction in nurturing growing things. She befriended the ranch hands, learning their stories, making sure they felt welcomed and valued. And every night, Caleb came home to her, tired, dusty, but always with a smile when he saw her. He'd wash up and they'd share dinner, talking about their days. Then he'd pull her close and make her feel like the most precious thing in his world, showing her with hands and lips and whispered words just how much he cherished her. When winter came and snow isolated them for weeks at a time, Eleanor discovered the joy of quiet intimacy, reading together by the fire, Caleb's head in her lap as she ran her fingers through his dark hair, making love under thick quilts while snow fell outside, their breath visible in the cold air until their bodies generated enough heat to warm the entire room, learning every detail of each other's hearts. The first major snowstorm hit in late November, transforming the ranch into a world of white silence. Caleb had spent the day before securing the animals and bringing in enough firewood to last weeks. When the snow finally stopped 3 days later, they were completely snowed in, the drifts reaching halfway up the windows. Eleanor woke on the third morning to find Caleb watching her, his dark eyes soft with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What are you thinking?" she asked, reaching up to touch his face. "That I've never been this happy," Caleb said simply. "That I wake up every morning and can't quite believe you're real, that you chose me." "I'll always choose you," Eleanor promised. They spent that day in bed, only leaving to tend the fire and eat simple meals. Caleb made love to her slowly, thoroughly, taking his time to worship every inch of her skin. Eleanor marveled at how this intimacy had become both familiar and endlessly new, how each time they came together felt like both a homecoming and an adventure. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Caleb said later, holding her close as the fire crackled in the hearth. Eleanor thought for a moment. "When I was 16, I wanted to be a teacher. I loved learning, loved books, but my aunt said education made women unfeminine, unmarriageable, so I let that dream die." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "We could change that." "What do you mean?" "Silver Creek needs a school. Right now, families have to send their children to the next town or teach them at home. You could start a school here on the ranch. We could convert one of the barns." Eleanor sat up, looking at him in wonder. "You'd do that? Support me in teaching?" "Eleanor, I want you to be happy, to be fulfilled. If teaching makes you happy, then we'll make it happen." He pulled her back down against his chest. "Besides, Our children will need a teacher eventually. Our children. The words sent a thrill through Eleanor that she didn't quite understand yet. In return, Caleb told her about his parents, who died when he was 19, leaving him the ranch. About the crushing loneliness of those first years, trying to prove himself to neighboring ranchers who thought he was too young to manage such a large operation. About meeting Sarah at a church social and feeling like he could finally breathe again. She was sunshine, Caleb said softly, bright and warm and full of laughter. When the fever took her, I thought the light had gone out of the world forever. And now? Eleanor asked. Caleb turned to look at her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Now I've learned that there are different kinds of light. Sarah was sunshine, bright and cheerful. Your firelight, warm and steady and essential. I need you, Eleanor, in a way I've never needed anyone. You're not replacing what I had. You're creating something new and equally precious. Eleanor kissed him then, pouring all her love into the gesture. As winter deepened, they developed their own rhythms and traditions. Caleb taught Eleanor to play chess, and they'd spend evenings locked in playful competition. She taught him card games her mother had loved, laughing at his terrible poker face. One snowy evening, Caleb came in from checking the animals to find Eleanor had pushed all the furniture in the main room to the edges and was standing in the middle of the empty space. "What are you doing?" he asked, amusement coloring his voice. "Dance with me," Eleanor said, holding out her hand. "There's no music." "Then hum something." Caleb set down his coat and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. He began to hum a simple waltz, and they moved together in the firelit room, Eleanor's small feet following his lead perfectly. When the improvised song ended, he dipped her dramatically, making her squeal with laughter. "You're ridiculous," she said, but she was smiling. "You love it," Caleb countered, pulling her back up and into a kiss. They made love right there on the rug in front of the fire, urgent and passionate, Eleanor's laughter turning to gasps of pleasure as Caleb showed her yet another way their bodies could bring each other joy. The isolation of winter also brought challenges. Eleanor struggled with the endless sameness of snowy days, missing the social connections of town. There were moments when the walls seemed to close in, when she felt the weight of just how far they were from civilization. During one particularly difficult week, when the cold was so severe they could barely keep the house warm, Eleanor broke down crying over a trivial thing, spilled coffee on a dress. Caleb found her sobbing in their bedroom and immediately wrapped her in his arms. "I'm sorry," Eleanor hiccuped. "I'm being ridiculous. It's just a dress." "It's not about the dress," Caleb said gently. "You're lonely, isolated. This is hard, Eleanor. I should have prepared you better for what winter out here is really like. I chose this," Eleanor said. "I chose you. I have no right to complain." "You have every right," Caleb said firmly. "Just because you chose this life doesn't mean you're not allowed to struggle with it sometimes. Talk to me, Eleanor. Tell me when you're struggling." So she did. She told him about missing female companionship, about feeling cut off from the world, about sometimes wondering if she was losing herself in the endless white sameness of winter. Caleb listened without judgment, then held her while she cried out her frustration and fear. When her tears finally subsided, he said, "When the road's clear, we're going to town. You can stay with Mrs. Patterson for a few days if you want. Visit with Sarah Chen and the other women. I never want you to feel trapped here, Eleanor." "I'm not trapped," Eleanor said. "I'm just adjusting still. Promise me you'll tell me when you need connection beyond just me. I love you, but I can't be everything to you. That's not fair to either of us." The honesty of his words, the way he validated her feelings instead of dismissing them, made Eleanor love him even more. When spring finally came, melting the snow and turning the world green again, Eleanor felt reborn. She threw herself into planning her garden, into visiting town regularly, into building friendships with the other ranch wives in the area, and it was during one of these visits to town, in late April, that Sarah Chen pulled her aside at the general store. "You're pregnant," Sarah said matter-of-factly. Eleanor blinked. "What? No, But even as she said it, pieces clicked into place. The exhaustion she'd been blaming on spring cleaning, the way certain smells made her nauseous, the tenderness in her breasts. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered. "I think I am." Sarah smiled. "Congratulations, dear. Does Caleb know?" "Not yet. I just realized." Eleanor pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, wonder and fear warring inside her. She rode back to the ranch in a daze, her mind racing. A baby. She was going to have Caleb's baby. The idea thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Caleb was working in the corral when she arrived home. Eleanor watched him for a moment. This strong, gentle man who was going to be a father. Her heart swelled with love so intense it almost hurt. "Caleb!" she called out. He looked up, immediately vaulting over the fence when he saw her expression. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" "I'm pregnant," Eleanor blurted out. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment, his face cycling through shock, joy, and something close to fear. "A baby," he whispered. Eleanor nodded, suddenly nervous. "Are you happy?" Caleb crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me so much, Eleanor. A home again, a purpose, and now a family." He looked up at her, tears shining in his dark eyes. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I love you more than I thought possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Eleanor said, running her fingers through his hair. "You saved me, Caleb, from a life of quiet desperation. You showed me what it means to be truly wanted. We saved each other," Caleb corrected, standing and pulling her into his arms with exquisite care, as if she were suddenly fragile. 2 broken people who found a way to be whole together. That night, Caleb was impossibly tender with her, his large hands gentle as they traced her stomach, his voice soft as he whispered to the child she carried. The baby, a girl they named Sarah Hope, was born on a crisp autumn morning, with Caleb holding Eleanor's hand through every moment of labor. The pregnancy had been both wonderful and difficult. Caleb had become impossibly protective, hovering over Eleanor like she might break at any moment. He'd forbidden her from riding horses, from lifting anything heavy, from doing half the chores she normally managed. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Eleanor had protested one day when he'd physically lifted her out of the garden she'd been weeding. "You're carrying my child," Caleb had said, his jaw set stubbornly, "the most precious cargo in the world. I'm not taking any chances." Eleanor had wanted to argue, but the tenderness in his eyes, the protective possessiveness in his touch, had melted her irritation. He loved her so much it scared him, she realized. Loved this baby they'd created together with an intensity that bordered on fear. As her belly grew, Caleb would spend hours with his hand pressed against it, marveling at every kick and flutter. He talked to the baby constantly, telling stories about the ranch, about Eleanor, about all the adventures they'd have together. "What if I'm not a good father?" he'd confessed one night, his hand splayed across her rounded stomach. "What if I failed this child the way I failed Sarah?" "You didn't fail Sarah," Eleanor had said firmly. "You loved her completely. That's all you can do. Love completely and hope it's enough." "It has to be enough," Caleb had whispered, pressing a kiss to Eleanor's belly, "because I already love this baby more than my own life." Labor had started in the pre-dawn hours, 3 weeks before the doctor had expected. Eleanor had woken to cramping pain and wetness, terrified she was losing the baby. Caleb had immediately sent one of the ranch hands racing to town for the doctor and the midwife, but the labor progressed so quickly, neither arrived in time. It was just the 2 of them in their bedroom when Sarah Hope decided to make her entrance into the world. Maria had come to help, coaching Eleanor through the contractions, while Caleb looked like he might pass out from fear. "I can't do this," Eleanor had gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. "Caleb, I can't." "Yes, you can," he'd said fiercely, gripping her hand. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You can do anything." And somehow, with Caleb's hand in hers and his voice in her ear, Eleanor had found the strength to push through the pain. When Sarah Hope finally emerged, tiny and red-faced and screaming her displeasure at the world, Eleanor had sobbed with relief. Caleb had cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as Maria cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft blankets. When he held his daughter for the first time, this giant of a man cradling the tiny infant with infinite tenderness, Eleanor fell in love with him all over again. "She has your eyes," Caleb said wonderingly, looking between Eleanor and their daughter. "Look at her, Eleanor. She's perfect. You made something perfect." "We made her," Eleanor corrected softly, "together." Sarah Hope was a good baby, though she had her father's stubborn streak and her mother's determination. Caleb was besotted from the first moment, getting up for night feedings, even though Eleanor was nursing, just so he could hold his daughter and sing her soft lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice. Eleanor would watch them together, her massive husband cradling their tiny baby with such gentle reverence, and feel her heart swell with love. "You're a natural," she told him one night, watching him pace the bedroom with Sarah Hope against his shoulder, patting her back until she burped. "She's easy to love," Caleb said, pressing a kiss to the baby's downy head, just like her mother. Those first months were exhausting and wonderful. Eleanor was constantly tired, her body recovering from childbirth while adjusting to the demands of a newborn. Caleb hired additional help for the household so Eleanor could focus on the baby, and he rearranged his schedule so he was never far from the house. "I don't want to miss anything," he explained, when Eleanor told him he was being overprotective again. "I miss so much with Sarah. She died before we could start a family. I'm not missing a moment of this." Eleanor understood. She knew he lived with the constant fear that happiness this complete couldn't last, that it would be snatched away like it had been before. So she let him hover, let him check on them constantly, let him be the devoted father and husband he so desperately wanted to be. One night, when Sarah Hope was 3 months old, Eleanor woke to find Caleb's side of the bed empty. She found him in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair with their daughter in his arms, both of them asleep. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her heart full. This moment of perfect peace, her husband and daughter peaceful in sleep, this was everything she'd never dared hope for, everything she'd found when she'd been brave enough to choose love over security. She thought about Gerald Winchester sometimes, wondered if he'd found happiness with his eventual bride. She hoped he had, hoped he'd learned that partnership needed more than just practicality to thrive. But mostly, she was just grateful for her own journey, for the courage to step off that stagecoach and into an unknown future, for Caleb's patient courtship and his offer of choice rather than obligation, for every moment of joy and challenge that had brought them to this point. They built their life together day by day, year by year. The ranch prospered under Caleb's care. More children came, 2 boys who inherited their father's size and gentle nature. Eleanor became a pillar of the community, helping new brides adjust to frontier life, offering quiet support to women in difficult situations. Sarah Hope grew into a spirited little girl with her mother's determination and her father's kind heart. When she was 4, Eleanor started the school she'd dreamed of, converting one of the ranch's outbuildings into a proper classroom. Children from neighboring ranches came to learn, and Eleanor discovered a fulfillment she'd never imagined. Caleb would often pause in his work to watch through the window as Eleanor taught, her face animated as she shared her love of learning with the next generation. "I married a teacher," he'd say with pride. "Smartest thing I ever did." Their sons, Benjamin and James, were born 2 and 3 years after Sarah Hope. Each birth terrified Caleb. He paced like a caged animal during Eleanor's labors, convinced something would go wrong. But each time, Eleanor proved her strength, and each time, Caleb fell more deeply in love with his wife. 3 perfect children, he'd say, gathering all of them in his large arms, while Eleanor laughed at the chaos. "How did I get so lucky?" "You chose love," Eleanor would remind him. "We both did. Life on the ranch wasn't always easy. There were hard years, the summer when drought killed half their cattle, the winter when influenza swept through the valley, and Eleanor nursed their children through terrifying fevers, while Caleb worked himself to exhaustion caring for the animals. There was the day a horse kicked James when he was 6, breaking his arm in 2 places. Eleanor had held their crying son, while Caleb rode like fury to fetch the doctor, his face white with fear. The hours waiting for the doctor had been some of the longest of their marriage. "He'll be all right," Eleanor had assured Caleb that night as they watched James sleep, his small arms splintered and bandaged. "Children are resilient." "I can't lose any of you," Caleb had said roughly, pulling Eleanor close. "You're all my whole world. If something happened, nothing's going to happen," Eleanor had said firmly. "We're strong, Caleb. All of us. We're survivors." But there were far more joyful moments than difficult ones. Teaching Sarah Hope to read, watching her devour books the way Eleanor once had. Benjamin's first successful ride on a horse, his face glowing with pride as Caleb coached him through it. James's gentle nature, the way he collected injured animals and nursed them back to health. There were summer picnics by the creek, the whole family splashing in the water while Caleb and Eleanor watched from the bank. Winter evenings huddled together while Caleb told stories and Eleanor read aloud from adventure novels. Spring days when they all worked together in the garden, planting seeds and dreaming of the harvest to come. Eleanor watched Caleb grow into fatherhood with wonder. He was endlessly patient with their children, firm but fair, teaching them to work hard but also to be kind. He showed Benjamin and James how to gentle a horse, how to read the sky for weather, how to treat the land with respect. But he also braided Sarah Hope's hair with surprising dexterity for such large hands, had tea parties with her dolls, and defended her right to learn ranching alongside her brothers. "She's going to break hearts when she grows up," Caleb said one day, watching 10-year-old Sarah Hope expertly lassoing fence posts. "Like her father broke mine," Eleanor teased, leaning against Caleb's solid warmth. "I didn't break your heart," Caleb protested. "I won it." "You did," Eleanor agreed, "and you've kept it safe every day since." Sometimes, when Gerald Winchester passed them on the street in town, Eleanor would catch the bitterness in his eyes. He'd eventually married someone else, a proper banker's wife who smiled at the right times and never questioned his decisions. They had one child, a pale, quiet boy who always looked vaguely unhappy. Eleanor felt pity for them both, trapped in their practical arrangement. Gerald's wife wore expensive dresses and hosted perfect dinner parties, but Eleanor never saw joy in her eyes, never saw the kind of partnership Eleanor and Caleb had built. One day, about 8 years into their marriage, Eleanor encountered Gerald's wife, Patricia, at the general store. The woman looked exhausted despite her fine clothes, and there was a bruise on her wrist she tried to hide with her sleeve. "Mrs. Winchester," Eleanor said kindly. "How are you?" Patricia's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. "Well, thank you, Mrs. Morgan." Her eyes drifted to where Caleb was loading supplies into their wagon. Sarah Hope perched on his shoulders, chattering about the new book Eleanor had ordered. "Your husband seems very involved with your children." "He is," Eleanor said. "He's a wonderful father. Gerald says men shouldn't coddle children, that it makes them soft." Patricia's voice was wistful. "But your children seem happy and strong." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Love doesn't make people weak, Mrs. Winchester. It makes them brave. My children know they're cherished, so they have the courage to try new things, to take risks, to be themselves." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You made the right choice," she said finally, so softly Eleanor almost didn't hear. "Leaving him. I wish I'd had your courage." Before Eleanor could respond, Gerald appeared, his hand closing around Patricia's arm in a grip that made her wince. "We're leaving," he said curtly, not even acknowledging Eleanor. He pulled Patricia toward the door, and Eleanor saw the resignation in the other woman's eyes. That night, Eleanor held Caleb a little tighter, grateful once again for the choice she'd made. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked, sensing her mood. Eleanor told him about the encounter, about the bruise on Patricia's wrist, about the sadness in her eyes. Caleb's jaw tightened. "There's nothing you can do," Eleanor said sadly. "She made her choice, just like I made mine. I just wish she'd chosen differently." "So do I," Caleb said, pulling her close. "But I'm grateful every day that you chose me, that you were brave enough to take the risk." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Eleanor back to the ridge where he'd first asked her to stay. They stood watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb's arms wrapped around her from behind. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd married Winchester?" Caleb asked. Eleanor leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling his heartbeat steady against her back. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I think about how miserable I would have been, how empty, how I would have spent my whole life being tolerated instead of treasured." "I think about it too," Caleb said quietly. "I think about how close I came to letting you go without fighting for you, how I almost convinced myself I had no right to even speak to you. But you did speak to me," Eleanor said, turning in his arms to look up at him. The setting sun cast his face in bronze and shadow, highlighting the lines that time and weather had etched around his eyes. He was older now, his dark hair showing threads of silver at the temples, but to Eleanor, he was more beautiful than ever. "You gave me a choice. That's what made all the difference, Caleb. You didn't demand or pressure or manipulate. You just offered me the truth and let me decide. I wanted you to choose me because you really wanted to. Caleb said, echoing the words that had changed both their lives. Not because you felt obligated or had no other options. And I chose you, Eleanor said softly. Every day since then I've chosen you, and I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. Caleb kissed her then, tender and deep, with all the love of a decade of marriage behind it. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. I love you, Eleanor Morgan, Caleb said. More today than yesterday. More tomorrow than today. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you too, Eleanor whispered. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a purpose, a family. But most of all, you gave me the freedom to be myself and the security of knowing I'm loved exactly as I am. They stood together on that ridge as the sun set and the first stars appeared, two people who'd found their way through pain and loneliness to build something beautiful together. When they rode back to the ranch, their home, their children were waiting on the porch. Sarah Hope, now 13, held baby Thomas, a surprise addition to their family 2 years prior, while Benjamin and James wrestled in the yard under Maria's watchful eye. "Mama, Papa!" James called out, running to meet them. "Can we have the honey cakes Maria made?" Caleb laughed, swinging down from his horse and scooping James up effortlessly despite the boy's growing size. "After dinner, son." Eleanor dismounted more slowly, her body showing the evidence of bearing 4 children and 10 years of ranch life. She wasn't the frightened woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach all those years ago. She was stronger now, more confident, grounded in the knowledge of who she was and what she was capable of. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Caleb sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. "Do you have any regrets?" Eleanor asked. Caleb pulled her closer, his large hand engulfing hers. "Not a single one." "You?" "None," Eleanor said truthfully. "Sometimes I'm amazed by how much courage it took to make that choice, to walk away from what was expected and choose what I wanted instead." "You were always brave," Caleb said. "I just gave you a reason to be." "We gave each other reasons," Eleanor corrected. "You showed me what love should look like. I showed you that you deserved a second chance at happiness." As they rode back to the ranch, their home, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd left Boston a frightened woman, running toward what she thought was safety. She'd arrived in Silver Creek, expecting to settle for a loveless marriage, to trade her freedom for security. Instead, she'd found Caleb. She'd found courage she didn't know she possessed. She'd found that the scariest choice could also be the most rewarding one. They'd packed her bags so she could marry a stranger, but the cowboy had said, "I want you to choose me because you really want to." And in choosing him, in choosing love over convenience and passion over propriety, Eleanor had found everything she'd never dared to hope for. She had found home. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask how they met, Caleb would smile and say, "Your grandmother stepped off a stagecoach bound for the wrong man, and I was lucky enough to convince her to change direction." And Eleanor would add, "The best decisions are the ones that scare you the most. Remember that, little ones. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose what your heart wants instead of what others expect." Or the sun would set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the Morgan family would gather on the porch of the ranch house that love had built. And Eleanor would lean against Caleb's solid warmth, grateful every day for the courage to choose love, for the man who'd offered her freedom instead of obligation, and for the beautiful life they'd created together. In the end, she hadn't just found a husband. She'd found her partner, her home, and her heart's true desire, and that made all the difference.